Hollywood really needs to stop. For those unaware, just the other day, I went to see The Unbreakable Boy, a new movie from Lionsgate and Kingdom Story that just came out in theaters. This movie supposedly is about an autistic boy named Austin, who spreads joy to those around him. At least that's what this movie's marketing would like you to believe.
I think that you're navigating the waters of having a child with autism, which is something that at this point, it touches all of our lives, every one of us. Either we have autism, our kids do, our friends' kids, our kids' friends. I mean, it's that.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Unfortunately, The Unbreakable Boy is yet another blunder for Hollywood, trying to showcase autism, being not only terrible autism representation, but also just extremely poor execution as a film overall. Hollywood has a very shaky track record with autism representation in film in general, with many autistic characters in major movies easily just coming off as soulless savants or infantilized pets, with no real development or nuanced characterization. And unfortunately, The Unbreakable Boy seems to be yet another film that so very much misses the mark on something like this. But with The Unbreakable Boy, this is actually a much deeper case than most people may realize, certainly more so than your average case of bad autism representation in film. So today, I want to discuss not just the plot of this film and why it fumbles the bag so hard in portraying an autistic film character, but also why the film actually exists now and how it's actually been in development for almost 10 years. Yes, you heard that right. Somehow, this film, an abysmal representation of autism, has actually been in the works for nearly a decade. Believe me, I'm as shocked as you are. We'll be explaining that and why that definitely shows in the final product. But to start, let's explain exactly what The Unbreakable Boy is as a film. For a brief synopsis, The Unbreakable Boy is actually based on a book written by Scott Lorette, who is actually the real-life father of Austin Lorette, who himself is a real autistic person. The story follows Scott Lorette as he finds out his girlfriend is pregnant, so he marries her, and they end up raising a child together who they name Austin. Austin has brittle bone disease, which is genetic from his mother, and also is later diagnosed with autism. After discovering this, they decide to put their son on medication. Keep this in mind, this will be very, very important later. Later on, they end up having another kid who they end up naming Logan. While raising his kid, Scott proves to be a raging alcoholic and neglects his wife and his kids, and ends up throwing his son in a mental institution for a number of weeks, which, believe me, we'll talk about that specific moment in great detail later. After getting extremely drunk one night with his kids in tow and crashing their Jeep into the front of the house on the way home, his wife throws him out of the house and he must get sober and face his mistakes head on. He supposedly becomes a better person, ends up reconciling with his family, now clearly made a better person thanks to his sobriety and his autistic son lifting him up and making him feel better. Because that's totally what autistic people are only good for. Good God. You may have noticed something particularly interesting about the synopsis, brief as it was, but it was shockingly devoid of Austin for the most part, who of course is the main autistic child and also the namesake of the film. That's because Austin isn't even the main character of this film. It is of course his dad, Scott Lorette, who is portrayed by Zachary Levi. Interestingly enough, Scott Lorette is also the executive producer of this film since it was created in partnership with Lionsgate by his own independent film studio that he founded, known as Kingdom Story. Strange coincidence there for sure. Scott Lorette initially began posting about Austin in a blog called Austintistic, actually all the way back in 2011, and ended up getting some traction through posting pictures of Austin and showcasing him doing everyday things such as going to his school's prom or watching movies with his brother. See, look guys, he's just like us neurotypical folk. Now why don't you go ahead and follow my blog? This blog was so popular, it won an award from Autism Speaks, which, oh boy, does that say a lot. Also the fact that Scott Lorette is actually someone who actively praises Autism Speaks, so that's even better. After doing the blog for a number of years, Scott ended up creating a book called The Unbreakable Boy, which discussed his experiences being a raging alcoholic and having his autistic son around to boost his morale when he needed it, which was published in 2014, and also became a modest success, especially in faith-based circles. And interestingly enough, around 2016, Scott began posting on his blog and other socials that he was looking to create a film based on the Unbreakable Boy book that he wrote, and began visiting various film festivals to shop around this idea before ultimately going ahead and founding his own independently operated film distribution label that functioned as a branch of Lionsgate. This film was actually initially supposed to release in 2021, but was pushed back, eventually releasing in this year, 2025. I wonder what could have happened in 2021 that might have caused this sudden pushback for a release date. Oh no. This has been speculated by a few different people in the autistic community, actually even before myself, but more than likely the reason for the Unbreakable Boy's pushback release was the fact that Music actually came out that year, which is a film I've discussed before, and also a film with some notably egregious autism representation as well, with its autistic character very much coming off as more of an infantilized pet and an offensive stereotype. And speaking of which, now that we've gotten the general background of the film out of the way, let's dive into the specific brand of autism representation that this film just so happens to have, since I imagine that's what most people are curious to hear about in particular. I will say, Austin is a slight improvement over Music, even though, in all honesty, that isn't really saying much. He does show enthusiasm for various films and talks about them quite a bit, and also talks a lot to everyone about his hyperfixation, and that's kind of it. Yeah, unfortunately, this movie really does fall into the same traps that films like Sia's Music do, since rather than create a more nuanced, developed look at autistic character that could create more appreciation and awareness for the depth to the autism spectrum, this film is just content to constantly show Austin running around and talking about things that he likes non-stop. It comes off as treating him more like a joke or pet than anything else, and this is further exemplified by the way the parents handle it as well, since at one point in the film, they end up both hiding in the closet together when Austin is trying to find them to talk to them. And of course, this entire moment is played off like a joke, like, come on guys, really? This portrayal of Austin is incredibly shallow and two-dimensional, and you can really tell the filmmakers do not really care at all about highlighting any depth within a character like him. Because, again, it's not even about him, it's just about his dad. For the filmmakers, autism seems to boil down to just talking a lot and being excited about things like Star Wars or dinosaurs, which really misses any depth or deeper internal struggles that could be tackled by showcasing a character with autism, such as discussing the nagging feeling to mask oneself around neurotypical people, or things like autistic burnout, sensory overload, and other things like that. If this film had bothered to do more research or actually hire autistic actors or writers, it may have been able to pull off more depth with how it tackles autism, rather than just creating this two-dimensional stereotype. This ultimately is just rather harmful misinformation about what autism is, since it doesn't dive into the deeper struggles that absolutely do come with being on the spectrum. And speaking of harmful misinformation, it's worth bringing up the specific scene I mentioned earlier here, where Austin is thrown into a mental institution by his parents for a number of weeks. Before I dive fully into that, however, I do want to say, if you haven't subscribed already, definitely do so. If you've enjoyed this video so far, you'll likely enjoy most of my content overall, since I discuss film and also autism representation in film quite frequently, as well as just film tropes as a whole. Also consider joining my Discord, where you can suggest topics for me to cover here on YouTube. You can check out my Letterboxd as well, where I'll cover movies and shows that I won't always review on YouTube. All links are down in the description. I also do want to give a slight trigger warning for the scene I'm about to discuss, since when I saw it in theaters myself, I was honestly quite appalled by what happened. I'll put a time code down below for you to skip to if you want to skip over this segment. The scene in question takes place around midway through the film when Austin and his family are having dinner together. Scott and his wife end up mixing up Austin's medication and up giving him the wrong meds right before dinner. So for some reason, in the span of about 2 seconds, Austin goes from 0 to 100, immediately transforming from a two-dimensional happy pet into a two-dimensional viciously angry pet, suddenly choosing to yell out the R slur directly at his parents and brother about 10 times in a row. No, I am not making this up, even though I wish I was. While the movie had already made it clear it wasn't interested in really doing any sort of real representation for autism already, this takes things to an entirely different level of awful. The fact that the filmmakers thought it would be okay to make their main autistic character, whom the film is pretty much solely marketed off of, despite him not even really being the focal point of the film, yell the R slur repeatedly 2 seconds after being given the wrong medication from his parents is absolutely mind-blowing. But what happens after this is somehow even worse. After witnessing Austin's eruptive behavior, his mom and his dad forcefully take him to a mental institution where he can hopefully be medicated by the doctors there and leave him there for a few weeks, not even bothering to visit him. What in the world. The fact we're supposed to sympathize with the parents in this scene and see Austin as the bad guy here is absolutely mind-boggling and straight up infuriating. The only reason Austin even started doing that was because he received the wrong medication 2 seconds earlier, which, as unrealistic as that sudden change is, was still caused by his parents. Austin clearly is not taking medication on his own and does appear to solely depend on his parents to give it to him. So it's entirely on them that any of this happened. And the fact they choose to try and literally dump any blame or problems that might come afterward off by leaving Austin in a mental institution for 3 weeks without visiting him is unbelievably wrong and messed up on a number of levels. This is easily the most harmful scene in the movie, and I was absolutely appalled when I first saw it in theaters myself. This should not be something that is portrayed as an okay solution to a situation like this, especially when the parents are at fault for what happened. And immediately after this scene, Scott's imaginary friend Joe tells Scott he did the right thing, reassuring him of his awful decision. And yes, you heard that right. Throughout the entirety of this film, Scott has an imaginary friend named Joe constantly telling him he's making the right choices, at least up until the very end of the film. And yes, I wish I was making that up too. This is actually called out in the film itself, with Austin, who actually does narrate the film as an unseen narrator at times, which, to be honest, is usually the most involvement he actually gets within the narrative itself, comparing his dad's imaginary friend to Tyler Durden from Fight Club. And lo and behold, during a scene that takes place during Halloween, Joe is right next to Scott, dressed exactly like Tyler. Geez, subtlety, what's that? Ultimately, however, Joe's existence in the film clearly only serves to try and tell Scott that he's making the right decisions with how he's raising his autistic son, even when he very clearly is not, like with the mental institution scene. It feels like a weird insert into the film to almost not so subtly tell the audience this is an okay way to treat autistic people, which honestly just makes the whole thing even more disgusting. As if falsely advertising your film about being an autistic boy named Austin and choosing to cast an actor who thinks vaccines cause autism as his dad wasn't bad enough. And yes, sadly, Zachary Levi, who, as stated before, plays the role of Scott Lorette in this film, does believe that vaccines cause autism, which clearly makes him the perfect spokesperson for this movie. So you know what? That doesn't surprise me at all that he ended up in this film. But interestingly enough, Zachary Levi actually more than likely has a lot to do with the way the film was finally released as well. Zachary Levi has been in rather hot water as of late, starting with this statement last year of him thinking that vaccines cause autism, among other rather troubling things he stated about co-stars of his. On top of this, 2 of his major films in recent memory have flopped, with Shazam 2 from DC and Warner Brothers, in which he stars as the main character, Billy Batson aka Shazam, underperforming at the box office. And Harold and the Purple Crayon, a film he did with Sony Pictures, becoming an even bigger box office disaster, making $32 million against a budget of $40 million. So while The Unbreakable Boy had been shelved for an undesignated amount of time previously by Kingdom Story and Lionsgate, it's possible that Zachary himself lobbied for the film to be released this year, since it had already been completed, and possibly in a bid to win back some goodwill for himself. Needless to say, this doesn't seem to have worked, with the film currently sitting at 48% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 5.8 on IMDb. In some ways, Zachary Levi is actually the perfect actor to play Scott Lorette, a man who has openly supported Autism Speaks and also seems to prop up his autistic son as not much more than an object or a way to gain favor with those around him. Heck, he's even been interviewed on Autism Live, a web show where autism dads and moms parade their children around and also advocate for ABA therapy, which, if you don't know what that is essentially shock conversion therapy utilized to quote-unquote cure an individual of being autistic. I guess fiction does mirror reality sometimes. Overall, while I wouldn't say this film is as bad as music, it's still pretty darn close, and it seems more concerned with presenting autistic people as just a means to lift neurotypical people up and nothing more than that. I know for a lot of people on the spectrum, such as myself, this is a mentality they often face from others on a daily basis, and sadly all this movie does is reinforce that. It really just makes me wish Hollywood would hire autistic writers or actors to work on films featuring stories about autism. It ultimately would create a much better final product and just a more genuine sense of representation, but but unfortunately, it doesn't look like that'll ever happen. However, if you're interested in seeing some portrayals that I have seen in film from autistic coded characters, and a few actually explicitly stated to be autistic characters as well, there's a few films I do just want to rattle off here that I think do a good job at that, and are absolutely worth watching if you want to learn more about it and see a really nuanced portrayal of autism. If you're interested in seeing good representations, check out movies like Lilo and Stitch, Atlantis: The Lost Empire, Mary and Max, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies, Tron Legacy, Rise of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles the movie, Loop, which is a Pixar short, Amadeus, and Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. While out of all the films I just mentioned, Mary and Max is actually the only one to feature an explicitly stated autistic character, the rest do a great job with autism coding, and in all honesty, I'll currently take that over things like The Unbreakable Boy or music. I do hope someday Hollywood will learn how to take heed and actually hire autistic actors or writers to tell autistic stories, but for now, all we can really do is keep advocating and getting our stories out there by any means we can. But with all that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. What do you think? Is The Unbreakable Boy a masterpiece? Am I horribly wrong? Let me know down in the comments below. Special thanks to my patrons DDC1986 and Trayvon Gibson. Patrons get early access to every video and also get to pick movies and shows for me to react to for the first time. If you're curious about what socials I used, you can see all those down below in the description. Once again, you can also check out my Discord to suggest future topics for me to cover here on YouTube and also interact with a lot of like-minded people overall. But regardless, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the other side. Bye!